Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to take a break from working on the lock mechanism and I'm going to forge out the main piece that I need to assemble the box. The top rim of the box is made around a heavy steel frame, and it's that frame that the bolts latch onto when the lid is closed. So the frame is just basically a square ring that wraps around all sides of the box, and I'm going to overlap the ends of the bar and weld them so that it makes one continuous piece. So forging that steel frame is the first step in assembling the box. Once I have the frame, I can fit the panels to it and then build the box from there. And I'll be forging the frame out of a length of 3/8 mild steel square bar. The length between the short sides of the frames needs to be forged very accurately because they have to engage the two side bolts. So I'm going to be using my forging gauge to measure that distance. It can be locked in place, and if it gets bumped, it's not going to lose its setting. The long sides of the frame aren't that critical because it's only engaging one of the bolts. So I'm just going to be using a regular pair of dividers to estimate that length. This forging gauge, as you can see, is just made out of electrical ground clamps, and I just used a couple of pieces of sheet metal to serve as the caliper arms. And all this gets bolted to a length of electrical conduit, so you could have a forging gauge that's 10 feet long if you wanted to. As usual, I'm using a piece that's a lot longer than I need. This bar happens to be 36 inches long. It should be plenty to wrap around this box and give me lots of overlap. I'm going to be working from the center of this bar and working out from that. Actually, this bar is just under 36, so I'm measuring 18 from either end and then just picking a spot in the center of those two marks. So these center punch marks are going to be the reference marks that I'm going to use to make my first two bends. These marks are always going to be visible because that section of the bar is never getting into the fire, so I'll be able to measure from that point very accurately. And eventually these marks are going to be hidden under the rim of the box, so I don't need to worry about getting rid of them. Now I'm going to be using the forging gauge to set up a pair of dividers that I'm going to be able to use to figure out where the corners need to be bent. So I'm lining up the center of the gauge with the center marks on the bar, and then I'm just opening up a pair of dividers until they get to the outside edge of the gauge. And then I'll measure both sides of the gauge just to confirm that that caliper setting is in fact in the center. And the final step is to use the dividers to place a chalk mark on the bar. The chalk mark tells me where to put the bar in the fire to get the heat centered over the bend, and then when I pull the bar out of the fire, the dividers are going to be used at the anvil from the center mark to allow me to locate that corner. I had to put a little kink in this bar to be able to get it into my forge. Normally it would be coming out straight. So now I'm just using the dividers to get a picture of where that corner is, and then I'll create a nice graceful bend with a good radius on it. And then I'll just keep measuring and working with the dividers until I get the corner where I want it. I'm going to be forging the corner a little bit off of this caliper setting because I'm going to push the corners back to square the inside edge of this frame, so I have a nice sharp corner on the inside edge. So I want a bit of material to be able to make that adjustment. So I'm just estimating how much material I'm going to need, and then I'm just going to keep pushing the bar around until I can get to those caliper settings. It's better to have the dimensions a little bit on the long side and to continue squaring up the corners of the frame until you get the dimensions that you want, because if you come up short, then you have to thin out the bar somewhere, and you might notice that in the box. If a corner winds up a little heavy because you've had to do a lot of upsetting to push the bar into a certain caliper setting, then you can always file or grind that back down to the size. That's less of a problem than the bar winding up too thin because you've had to stretch a dimension. If you really don't have any idea of, how much material you're going to need and you don't feel comfortable estimating, then the simplest thing to do is just to take a scrap piece of metal and bend that corner. Start off with a known measurement and then see how much material you're losing in that corner. And after one bend, you'll be able to get a pretty good idea of what you need to do. I'm not concerned about the outside corners being square because they're going to be inside the corners of the box. So if they're rounded, that doesn't matter. It's not like a decorative square corner where you're going to see both sides of it. I'm only concerned here about having enough material to square up the inside edge because that's going to be visible in the box. Now that I have the first two corners made, I'm going to use my forging gauge to see how the overall length is. I can adjust the corners in or out, whatever I need, because I haven't created any sharp bends anywhere in this bar. So there's a nice radius. I can just roll the corner one direction or another to get the dimension that I'm looking for. And I'm not going to be squaring up any of the corners until I have the frame totally wrapped around the box and welded into a solid unit. So right down to the end, I'm going to be able to move things around and not have to commit to a certain dimension too early in the game. Even though I know the dimension that I'm after and it would seem logical to finish the corners as I go around the frame, I don't want to do that because once the frame is a solid unit, I may have to play with those dimensions and make something 1/8 of an inch larger or a little bit smaller. So it's quite common to have to average things out once you have it locked in and welded as a unit. If I finish the corners as I'm working around the frame, I'd really be limiting my options for being able to adjust the overall shape of the frame, because the last part of the frame is going to be welding the two ends together, so that's kind of an unknown quantity. I can estimate it pretty closely, but if it comes out a little big, I need to be able to move that dimension around and average it out on the other sides to be able to make a frame that works. I know I'm doing a lot of talking for something that seems on the surface to be pretty straightforward, but this is really the kind of thought process that you need to get into when you're doing this kind of work. Don't forget, I'm only building one of these, and this is a forged piece, so you have to build in areas where you can make fine adjustments to get it right. So you start by getting yourself in the ballpark, and then you tighten up on those dimensions until you get exactly what you need. And of course, you just follow the same process to get the last corner done. Before I move on, I'm just going to take a minute to make sure that all the measurements are where I need them. I've let the bar cool down a little bit so I can take my time and take very accurate measurements. I haven't cut the bars to length, and I haven't started squaring up any of the corners, so each corner has a nice radius bend to it. So this is the absolute last time that I can make any adjustments to this frame. Next, I'm going to be cutting and welding the frame together, and then at that point I'm pretty much locked in. Here you can see how I've laid out for the scarf joints. The chalk marks are the center line for that side of the frame, and I basically just cut on either side of that center line. To make the weld, I'm going to need to overlap these bars by roughly the same dimension as the cross section of the bar, and then when I forge out that weld, that should bring the bars back to their original dimension. I'm not getting too carried away with the scarf joint. I'm just basically tapering the ends of the bars slightly so that I can overlap them and weld the two ends together. This shouldn't be seen in the finished box, so the weld just has to hold together. It doesn't have to be pretty. I may not even have the opportunity to fully forge out the weld. As I'm hammering out the weld, I'm going to be measuring the frame to see how the length is coming in. As soon as I get the length that I need, I'm going to stop forging. So the remainder of the weld is just going to be ground to shape or left as is. In hindsight, I should have oriented these scarf joints 90 degrees to the way I forged them out. I would have had a little easier time getting around the frame. Now that I have the welding done, I'm just going to do a final check on the dimensions. Now that the frame is welded up as a unit, I can start fine-tuning all of the corners. And what I'm going to be doing is just slowly working my way around the frame and making fine adjustments to each corner with each pass. So step one is just straightening out the bars that lead into the corners. On the next pass, I'm going to be refining that shape a little more until I get the defined inside corner that I'm looking for. And then once I have the inside edges of the corners well defined, I'm just going to continue forging the long sides to get down to the dimensions that I need. Here I'm a little further along and I'm just finishing off the final passes that are going to get the inside frame to the exact dimensions that I need. So I'm making very fine adjustments and I'm measuring with the calipers all the time. And the final step of the forging process is just to straighten out the sides as much as you can. I have a square block set up in my hardy hole because it's the easiest way to get around the frame, and it allows me to look down at the piece, so that it makes it a lot easier to see where I need to hammer. So now that the forging is done, I need to straighten up all these sides and clean up all the inside edges and make everything nice and clean, and then I'll be able to use this as a pattern for my box. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.